Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Kinsella, CEO of Up for Growth, a national cross-sector member network committed to solving America's housing underproduction through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. For those of you who are new to this series, this is the third episode in our annual Pro-Housing Policy webinar series. Really excited to welcome everyone on the line today. I know we had over 300 RSVPs, and it looks like the webinar is filling up. So very excited to have a robust conversation today on the topic of what to do in implementing ADU and zoning reform policy. For those of you who don't know Up for Growth, we are, as I mentioned, a national 501c3 pro-housing policy organization. We believe that housing should always be an opportunity, never an obstacle. And in fact, we understand housing stability is foundational to economic mobility, health and well-being, inclusion, and livelihood. But from cities to suburbs to rural communities across the country, the cost of housing and demand for it is grossly outpacing salaries and supply. And today, far too many Americans can't afford to live well where they want to work, play, and gather. Put simply, housing production isn't keeping pace with housing needs across the country. Artificial barriers, exclusionary zoning, and opposition from residents, or NIMBYism, often combine to create a severe underproduction of homes, a major driver of today's affordability crisis facing many communities across the country. These unjust policies that perpetuate the shortage continue to drive working families, people with low incomes, and people of color out of the highest opportunity neighborhoods, places that are rich in jobs, transportation, infrastructure, and community assets. We believe to create an access to opportunity and really a housing system that can serve everyone, policymakers must prioritize racial and economic equity outcomes and actively work to reverse our nation's severe shortage of homes. Housing should always be an opportunity, never an obstacle. And today's webinar is going to deal with one specific tool in the policy toolbox to tear down these exclusionary land use policies and barriers to housing equity across the country, and that's accessory dwelling unit and missing middle housing. Before I go on and preview today's discussion, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Laughlin. And Brian is the Housing and Community Development Committee Chair with the American Planning Association, and we are fortunate to have the American Planning Association as a partner in our work at Up for Growth and our presenting sponsor of this year's annual webinar series. So without further ado, Brian, I'd love to turn it over to you to share your perspectives on zoning reform and housing affordability.
Mike, thanks so much. And it's an honor to be here with all of you today, and I'm really excited that we have such a great turnout to talk about ADUs, something that the APA really thinks is an incredibly important tool as we address the current housing crisis. A little bit about our organization. We represent the nation's planning professionals and planning officials by providing research, education, and advocacy with the primary goal of planning and creating great communities for all. And so a lot of the things that you just outlined, Mike, as foci of Up for Growth could not be more in line with what the APA practices and preaches. Housing opportunity and zoning reform are really high priorities for the APA, and they drive a lot of our work in identifying innovative solutions to housing production and affordability. Housing affordability and zoning are two of our top key legislative and policy priorities for the APA, and we're currently engaged in promoting reform at all levels, from Capitol Hill all the way down to small town, city, and municipal governments, from federal policy to local codes. As you just outlined, Mike, we're in the midst of what unfortunately I keep calling the next great housing crisis. And it's a crisis that's marked by two really important characteristics: affordability and availability. Housing starts are at some of the lowest levels per capita since we started tracking things like housing starts, and the number of households that are severely cost burdened by rents and mortgages are at some of their highest rates. So in large part, the APA sees this as a supply side problem, much like your organization does. And we need every tool at our disposal, and we also need a number of new tools. ADUs is kind of an interesting combination of those two things. It's something that we've been doing for decades, centuries even, but it's something that is very much becoming a new tool in the lexicon of housing provision. And we think that's a great thing, and we're doing everything we can to put tools in people's hands and into local governments and local planners' hands so that they can make ADU reform a reality in their neighborhoods. So a couple of things that I do want to draw reference to before passing it back to you, Mike. The APA has put together an ADU knowledge base. It's something that is publicly accessible. You don't have to be an APA member. Anybody can get their hands on it, and it really does help folks kind of break down the ADU process in terms of zoning reform. There's also another white paper called Planning Home, which talks about the ADUs, but it talks about it in a broader context of the different things that municipalities can do to really open up the avenues to producing more housing, and especially more housing that's affordable in their communities. And lastly, we'll be in the months ahead, we'll be also issuing a similar white paper on larger zoning reforms. All of these things are accessible at the APA website to the public, and hopefully we could put those in the chat window so anyone here that's on the call can get their hands on them. Before I turn it back over to you, Mike, the one other thing I wanted to encourage folks to think about, it's very encouraging that we have a webinar like this focused around implementation, but I'd like everyone to remember all of their colleagues and friends and coworkers who work in other municipalities who aren't there yet, who still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting to the point that you are at now. And the way that we do that is that we take the lessons that you all have learned and share them. So I would encourage you also to use this organization and APA as avenues, as forums to share some of those lessons learned so that we can help all the other communities that are trying to get to the spot that you're at now. So with that, Mike, I turn it back over to you, and thank you so much for partnering with us on this great event.
No, hey, listen, thank you. Thank you, Brian. It's a real pleasure to collaborate with you and all of the folks at the American Planning Association, a critical partner of Up for Growth, and we're honored to engage in this work with you all. Before we get started, I'm going to pass the mic over, so to speak, to Caitlin Harris Walker momentarily, but I want to talk a bit more about some of the themes that Brian unpacked here for us. Look, I think that, after Caitlin, we're going to go over to Greg Payne, who is the Senior Housing Policy Advisor in in Governor Janet Mills's office in the state of Maine. Now, this webinar originated with a call from Greg to me, which is, hey, we've been working with Up for Growth for the past 3 years, first through Greg, my role at the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition, working on the legislative effort, and now in Greg's seat in the governor's office. And so the question is, how do we learn from the California experience? How do we learn from the Oregon experience or other jurisdictions around the country who have opened up zoning to allow for ADUs? How do we make sure these things actually get built? And our instinct was, that would be a great conversation, not just for the state of Maine, but for many of you on the webinar today to understand what are those best practices, where are the opportunities, where are the landmines for those working through the legislative process to open up zoning, or for those where zoning reforms have already occurred, where the opportunities really ramp up production of accessory dwelling units to better meet housing needs. So we're really excited to have this important conversation around implementation today. We think this is as useful for folks on the ground, stakeholders and policy implementers working to get this done as it is for folks in the earlier stages, to Brian's point on advocacy for ADU and zoning reform related policy proposals. And I'll just say, you know, we couldn't have a better room pulled together, and hats off to Keisha Easley, Up for Growth's membership director, and Omar Joyce for pulling this conversation together. Really excited for the discussion. Before I turn it over to Caitlin, I'll just share that, you know, going back to our opening comments, our severe underproduction of homes, accessory dwelling unit production and development is one of many strategies that we need to advance across the country to create housing equity and affordability for communities. And we all have a role to play. You know, today we're going to be joined by a policy expert from California, a practitioner building these things across the West. We're going to have a policy and advocacy expert from AARP in the conversation, and of course, from a financing perspective, we're lucky to have an expert from Freddie Mac on the webinar as well. Of course, moderated by Greg. We believe, and this is going to be a real focus of the discussion today, that ADU development, there's no magic bullet, you know, to turbocharge it, to increase it. There's a few buckets of challenges and considerations. Zoning restrictions, of course, uncertainty in the approval and permitting process, a lack of financing for folks who want to build that ADU in their backyard. You know, these barriers perpetuate not just the shortage of or the lack of production of accessory dwelling units, but really exacerbate inequities in a broader housing underproduction nationwide. And again, you know, today we're going to highlight state and local models that have been used to overcome these barriers, and discuss how private sector players like banks and builders, with the support of advocates and experts, can help maximize the production of affordable and market rate units, and particularly accessory dwelling units. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to our state series sponsor, Mortgage Bankers Association, represented by Caitlin Harris Walker. Caitlin is an associate director with MBA's Affordable Housing Initiative. Really fortunate to have the MBA as a partner in this fight as well. And so Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you, and then we can go straight to Greg.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you Up for Growth for this fantastic opportunity to sponsor this series. As you can tell from what Mike shared, it's going to be a great panel full of wonderful information and insights into the work that's going on in this space, which is absolutely crucial in this market today, as there's so many constraints, particularly on access to safe, affordable, and decent housing. So providing opportunity to expand in this space is great, and I'm excited to hear today's webinar. Just want to talk very briefly about the Mortgage Bankers Association. We launched our Affordable Housing Initiative in the summer of 2019. And we have two advisory councils, one on affordable rental housing and one on affordable homeownership. This is made up of roughly 20 to 25 C-suite executives on both sides, who are looking at the challenges in the affordable housing space, but also the innovative solutions that are at our fingertips to really move the needle on making a change on today's housing struggles and a crisis, as Mike had mentioned earlier. And I'm just so excited to talk about these additional opportunities and looking forward to being a part of Up for Growth's webinar series and being able to sponsor some of the upcoming events as well. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over today to Greg Payne. It's going to be our moderator and facilitator for today's webinar. Thank you again, Up for Growth. Thank you, Mike Kinsella. And thank you all of you who are tuning in live to today's session.
Thanks, Caitlin. I appreciate it. And thank you to Up for Growth for putting this together. It's a great group of over 200 people. I'm looking forward to this conversation and so happy we have this group of panelists. My name is Greg Payne, and I'm serving as the Senior Advisor on Housing Policy to Maine Governor Janet Mills. Prior to assuming that role last September, I worked for 15 years as the Director of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition and as a developer of affordable homes at a nonprofit housing agency based in Portland, Maine. As Mike mentioned, I started working with Up for Growth a few years ago when a group of us in Maine began to convene around an effort to pass statewide legislation addressing some of the zoning and land use restrictions that were and are creating additional barriers to the development of desperately needed housing units. From a policy perspective, the Mills administration is making unprecedented investments in affordable housing development programs. But we also realize that as helpful and important as those programs are, there is simply too much of a hole we're in now. The housing supply gap is so large that we are going to need to also engage the private sector to help solve it. So in addition to affordable housing program investments, we see it as critical that we change the conditions on the ground that are keeping the private sector from having a greater role in addressing our housing crisis. So the work that we did over the last several years ultimately resulted in the passage of LD 2003 here in Maine, which was signed into law by Governor Mills about 2 months ago. That legislation includes several statewide land use reforms, as well as new funding to provide municipalities with the resources that they need to add additional and locally driven reforms that will help further drive additional investments in needed affordable housing. The law creates a right to an ADU for all single-family homeowners. It allows for up to 4 units on lots in locally designated growth areas that otherwise are zoned as single-family, and it creates a statewide affordable housing density bonus. The new funding is available as of July 1st of this year, but the land use reforms don't go into effect until July 1st of 2023. So we have passed landmark legislation that has the potential to drive significant new housing creation around our state, but we know that there is a big difference between passing a law and making a law truly effective. So specifically as to the ADU provision, we want to work hard over the next year to operationalize the new property rights that homeowners will have. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to actually build ADUs and add the needed housing units that also don't require large amounts of government funding, which leads us to today's webinar. We passed ADU reform. Now what? How do we make the most of this opportunity to address our housing crisis? We have 4 panelists who are going to help us talk through these questions because we know that many other jurisdictions are currently contemplating the kind of ADU policy changes that Maine just made. David Garcia is Policy Director for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Gina Wazorek is Principal of Casitas Development. Kelly Morocco is the Director of Affordable Credit and Policy, Single Family at Freddie Mac. And Samar Jha is the Senior Legislative Representative at AARP. David, I am going to start with you because California has a well-earned reputation as a national leader on ADU policy and implementation. And I'm hoping you could further introduce yourself to the degree that you'd like to do that, but also share some of the lessons that you and your colleagues have learned over the course of your long history and work in creating ADUs in California.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate the opportunity. So, yeah, the interesting thing about ADUs in California is that, we essentially legalized ADUs way back in 2016 with Senate Bill 1069 there. And that was a big step forward for allowing for more homes in lower density neighborhoods. But we didn't see any significant uptake of ADU growth for a few years after that. So, for example, the state tracks permits and completed construction of ADUs. Today, we see about 20,000 units per year built, 20,000 ADUs built, which is a significant share of our overall development. We built about 100,000 units a year total in California. So ADUs make up anywhere between 15 and 20% of our overall growth. It was only until, I would say, 2020 where we really started to see those numbers spike to where they are now. It took several years of subsequent legislation to really see the growth that we are experiencing at this point. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first is that while the enabling legislation in 2016 essentially legalized accessory dwelling units, there are several other means by which localities were restricting the growth of ADUs. So things like using height restrictions, setbacks, minimum sizes, things like that. And it took a couple extra years of additional bills to really unlock the growth of ADUs. So once a couple other pieces of legislation were passed, cities couldn't go further than a 4-foot maximum setback. There are minimum sizes imposed, impact fees were lowered. That's when you really saw the growth of ADUs in California take off. So it's been really fascinating to see from the start in 2016 all the way to today, the steps that were needed in order to really get ADUs going in California. I think there's pretty significant lessons for other places, such as Maine, that are undertaking similar reforms. So anyways, I'll stop there. Happy to talk a little bit more about our work on this area, but hopefully that's helpful.
It is. Yes. Thanks, David. I want to ask the next question of Gina. And Gina, maybe you could, in part, introduce more of what Casitas Development does, but then share with us some of the best practices that your organization has used to spur ADU growth and efficient design. What kind of innovations seem to be working really well?
Sure. So for context, my name is Gina Wasorick. I, along with my business partner, Andrew Slocum, own a full-service ADU development and consulting firm called Casitas, and we're involved in all phases of the development process, everything from feasibility, permit design, to actually managing the build-out of the ADUs for multifamily owners. We're also owners ourselves. So just I actually, just to go along with what David was saying, for the first year that we started our company, which was towards the end of 2020, we were really educators. And so we were just not only educating multifamily owners on what was allowable by right on their properties to add these ADUs, but often we're working with planning and building and safety in many municipalities who had not yet adopted or written their own local ordinances after the state legislation had passed. And many times these municipalities didn't even know that you could add ADUs to multifamily, because prior to the legislation, it was focused on single family. So some cities rejected our initial submittal sets, not knowing that more than one ADU was allowed. And we've spent several hours over the course of the last year and a half working with these different municipalities about the adoption of their different ordinances. So I just want to be aware that everyone to be aware that as states continue to adopt ADU reform, community developed apartments and other vital departments that touch housing will have to go through a similar learning curve. But a couple best practices to share. Casitas, along with our colleague Samantha Hill of Design with Skill, we've worked as a consultant with cities who really have gotten behind ADUs. And specifically, there's a city of Pasadena and West Hollywood, which we consult with. They adopted a affordable ADU program using inclusionary and other funds. And those are programs that we helped execute, and those really raised awareness amongst ADUs, especially on single family, but also multifamily owners. So if anyone is interested, looking to help other cities adopt similar affordable ADU pilot programs, feel free to reach out about best practices that the different departments developed in order to make sure that these programs were successful.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to turn to, I'm sorry, thank you, Gina. I want to turn to Kelly because I think one of the things that, you quickly understand as people go towards, go from passing laws to trying to implement them is the challenges inherent in financing ADUs. And this is something that Kelly does a great deal of work on. In fact, Freddie Mac just recently announced some new policy changes aimed at ensuring more homeowners can benefit from accessory dwelling unit financing. So Kelly, could you walk us through those changes and how they're expected to make things easier for folks?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here today. Appreciate being on the panel and absolutely thrilled to tell y'all about our recent policy updates as of just June of this year. So we had a working group together for almost 18 months to really research this item. We worked with industry stakeholders, we worked with our regulator, FHFA, we worked with lenders to understand the market. We presented to our credit advisory board, engaged lenders, appraisers, other stakeholders to really understand what was the need, what was the ask from the market as far as, from our view, from a financing view. We partnered with our regulator, FHFA, for an ADU listening session in the summer of 2021 to get a better understanding of the market. I think the listening session went on for 5 or 6 hours. It was just a wealth of knowledge. What we learned, and this is what we know today, and thrilled to be here to continue our learning in this area. But what we learned and we heard from the market is that they wanted us to look at additional units that would allow ADUs, to look at the use of rental income to qualify for a mortgage that has an ADU, and to look at no cash out refinances to pay off short-term debt that was used to construct ADUs. So in our research, that's what we found. We also, our collateral folks, did a lot of work on recent zoning changes so that we would see, where the zoning was, what the ordinances, what the changings were. So in June, we did an ADU expansion around both our collateral and credit space. So previously, our mortgage, what we allowed was an ADU on a 1-unit dwelling. In response to recent zoning and ordinance changes in many geographic areas, we are now allowing an ADU on 2- and 3-unit properties. In addition to that, in the second ask, which was around the rental income generated from an ADU, we will now allow that. Previously, we only allowed it if there was a disabled person and it was a live-in aid. We would allow rental income from an ADU. Now we will allow rental income for a 1-unit subject property. So if it's a 1-unit and rental income, we will allow the rent to be used for qualifying. A couple caveats to that are that it's got to conform with zoning and land use requirements. So it has to be legal non-conforming, or no zoning. The appraisal report needs to establish that there is marketability, and that means that at least one of the comparable sales has to be an ADU that is rented. If you're a seller, you know that we have ACE, which is an automatic appraisal. That is not allowed for ADUs if you're using rental income, because we have to have that extra detailed analysis of the rental income. The appraiser, they do need 3 comparables showing the support of the rental income, but only one has to be an ADU. And as far as qualifying income, the ADU rental income can be up to 30% of the total qualifying income. In addition to that, one thing that we heard loud and clear from the market, where a lot of times it's first-time home buyers, is that the need for education. So we do require that at least one borrower participate in landlord education or have previous landlord education experience. No other changes were made to our rental section. And then the third part was the no cash out refinance to allow for the payoff of short-term debt that was used to construct the ADU. So we already did that today. So we made clarifications in our guide in our choice renovation section where you can use choice renovation to construct an ADU. That ADU could be a manufactured home. In addition to that, you could use the choice renovation offering to pay off short-term debt that was used to previously construct the ADU. So we feel like we have, come a long way in kind of looking at the flexibilities, trying to meet what the market asked is in this market. We also think this is a huge learning opportunity for us to get more data, understand the market, and of course work with stakeholders in this market to grow more. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That's a huge deal. And to answer the question that just came into the chat, I believe the team at Up for Growth is going to provide a link to the materials with all the details.
Okay, great.
Changes that that you just described. I want to ask a question of Samar next from AARP, because AARP has, as folks know, done considerable work to advance wider availability of ADUs as an affordable, accessible housing options for people of all ages. The question I have, Samar, is how have you been able to modify and adapt state laws and local zoning codes to encourage the creation of these new units?
Thank you, Greg, for this question. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. It's important to note that ARP has worked a lot on ADU legislation throughout the country. This is now, it feels nice to see that different states are working on ADU legislation, even at the local level and the state level, and even at the federal level, the administration is looking to work on housing options, which includes ADUs. As Greg was saying, ARP has worked a lot on ADU legislations, but our work does not stop after we help pass a legislation. Our work goes beyond that. I think implementation is really important, which is this seminar. I'll give you 3 examples of how we have worked with local administration and local governments to educate people about ADUs. One example, starting with Des Moines, Iowa. I saw a comment saying that about Iowa City, which has an ADU legislation, does not have a lot of ADUs. One thing people should understand, that when you pass an ADU legislation, it does not mean ADUs are going to be coming up the next day. It takes time for that. Similarly, so in Des Moines, Iowa, Iowa State Office, which is the ARP Iowa State Office, secured a 2020 ARP Community Challenge Grant and to fund construction of an ADU demonstration project. It is important to come up with these projects so that people can understand what ADUs are and how ADUs work and what's the process involved in that. So in Des Moines, Iowa, we worked on that. Similarly, in 2018, the Division of Aging and Disability Services of Lexington and Fayette County in Kentucky applied for and received a $10,000 ARP Community Challenge Grant to support an ADU design competition with University of Kentucky's College of Design. The competition aimed to support students and professionals who had ideas for what ADUs look like, and then provide tangible documents to help the public and local leaders understand that introduction of ADUs could mean to the community. Similarly, third example is where in ARP Vermont, Burlington had passed an ADU legislation. Now they are going beyond that, and the next tactic is doing webinars on ADUs to understand how ADUs work, what ADUs look like, and how the process is, and you have to go through the zoning board and get variances or certain permissions to get to build ADUs. So as Greg was saying, our work is going beyond passage of legislation, but to implementation also. Thank you.
Thank you, Samar. I'm going to stick with you for another question, but I'm going to invite the other panelists to weigh in on the same question, and that is, that much of the disparity that exists in ADU homeownership is the result of longstanding racially discriminatory practices that have been embedded into the housing system over many years. Given the benefit of historical and community context, how, in your opinion, do we begin to make some changes so that the benefits of ADUs are distributed more equitably? And again, maybe you could start, Samar, and then we can open it up to the other panelists.
From the legislative perspective, which is my work as being part of the government affairs team, is first of all, pass this ADU legislation. That is the first step. Work on ADU legislative issues, try to see whether you can pass at the local or the state level. And then after the passage, also within the ADU legislation, that there are lots of restrictive covenants that are there. We need to make sure that the kind of legislation that you're working on has less restrictive covenant, because that will affect your implementation, that will affect your production. That's one thing. But as we are talking about implementation, what we have to do is have a concerted education campaign to tell homeowners about the benefits of ADUs, the various benefits of ADUs. And I can give you a list of it, but I'll leave it for another question for that. But there are loads of benefits of building an ADU. So we have to educate the homeowners, like how they can actually benefit from that. Then the process to build an ADU, a lot of people do not know what the processes are, which includes getting approval from the zoning board, which includes getting an architect or working on that. And lastly, the most important thing is access to capital. Financing is a big issue. Sometimes these ADUs can be expensive, so to make sure that access is available. Now, we can talk about all these three things, and everything will be fine. But I think access to information does not mean there's equity. I think next step is to also provide special financing and credits to low to middle income homeowners or older adults or even first time home buyers to build an ADU. So as I said, you can give all the information to everyone, but if that same information to everyone, but equity will be when you give access to people who do not traditionally have access to such capital or such other means of making an ADU. I would say that start with that.
Thanks. David, Gina, Kelly, anybody have anything else you want to add here?
Yeah, I'll add quickly. This disparity in where ADUs is built is quite real. This is something we've observed in our research. Even though we have seen a significant uptake of ADUs in California, they are disproportionately built in affluent communities, which on one hand is not necessarily a bad thing, because oftentimes these are the communities that are most resistant to new housing. So any new supply that we can create in these places is positive. At the same time, we often talk about ADUs as a way for homeowners of color from traditionally disadvantaged groups can build equity and wealth. And if we are not seeing those groups being able to take advantage of that wealth building as a result of building an ADU, then there's a disconnect there. So one of the major things, Samar, to hit on this, is access to financing, because another thing that we've observed is that the majority of ADUs right now are being built by folks who have significant cash savings or can pull out a lot of equity in their home. And so those are options that are obviously more available to affluent homeowners than moderate and low income homeowners. So to the extent that products can be created at the GSE level, such as Freddie is doing, or supplemented to become more accessible, then we can really scale ADUs more equitably across more communities.
Yeah, and I'd have to say too, I think that one thing that's great is the reduction in impact fees that we've seen for California has made it accessible to more homeowners. Before, you'd see uptick of $40,000, $50,000 in permitting fees to build these, whereas it's a lot or $5,000 now, right? Depending on the size of the ADU that you're building. There's a big range, but that's helpful. But it also is educating about various programs. Again, on the financial side, Cal HFA is basically another tool that homeowners could use to supplement $40,000 of pre-development costs, which goes a really long way. And we need to spread the word about these programs, and especially in these various diverse neighborhoods.
Hi, and I would echo Gina. It's, if you're going to make a difference, it's outreach, education, and training. And Freddie Mac goes a long way to use all of our availability to do outreach and to get the word out. In addition, we do a significant level of training as far as training our sellers and what our guide says and how you can use it and implement it. We also partner with the Appraisal Institute so that they understand the collateral and how you can decipher an ADU from a 2-unit. So, I just can't emphasize enough that in order to make an equal playing field, it is outreach so that people have the resources and the tools, education and training. And we see that we do a lot of marketing, we do a lot of education, training, and outreach to try to bridge that gap.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question on my own and then switch over to some of the questions that are coming into the chat. And again, I kind of ask this question of everybody. Maybe I'll start with you, Kelly, but folks can chime in as they see fit. And that is, given that most producers of ADUs are not large corporate developers, but are rather largely small property owners, what dynamics do you wish that people were more aware of as they begin the process of building an ADU on their property?
In our research and what we, the reaching out to stakeholders and in the market, a lot of research with appraisers. It's really understanding the property and helping the appraiser and the borrower bridge that gap, such as, does the property owner who wants to build an ADU, do they know what the zoning is? Can they point to the zoning? Do they know where comparables are? A lot of times the MLS does not list it as an ADU or what the rental is. So helping, knowing the market where your house is, knowing what the rents are going for, so you can help that appraiser make an educated value on the appraisal. So knowing the market and helping the borrower. Borrower will come in and want to purchase a property and want to use rental income, but may not understand the zoning, may not have access, to a tenant, or so just any knowledge that the homeowner can give to the appraiser or the borrower of the location and the zoning and the market. Oftentimes in our neighborhoods, we know units that are rented out. An appraiser coming in may not know that a unit is rented. But if you can give them access to that information, anything to help bridge that gap would be helpful.
Thanks. And no obligation for the other panelists here to chime in on that question, but if anybody has something. If not, I am going to switch over to some of the questions. Actually, as I do that, I want to ask you, David, too, if you might respond to the issue of short-term rentals and any feedback you might have about concerns that could crop up in any jurisdictions that ADUs created under these kind of reforms could just sort of be lost as short-term rentals and not available as year-round housing for folks.
Sure. So we did, in partnership with some of our colleagues at Berkeley, a survey on ADU owners and found that the vast majority of them are either rented out on the open market or are provided to friends and family at no cost. So for caregivers or family members or whatnot. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I think it's below 10% in our survey that were listed as Airbnbs, as reported by the survey respondents. So could be higher. There's always a risk of some bias in some of these surveys. That being said, there's also some research that even when ADUs are initially built as a short-term rental explicitly, that over time they eventually convert into longer-term residential, either because the property changes hands, and the next owner decides to rent it up full time, or the original owner decides they don't like, having to change the sheets in an Airbnb 2 or 3 times a week, and then they would prefer a more stable form of income. So even in instances where you do see ADUs constructed more specifically for short-term rentals, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be for that use. And so there is some evidence to support that. The last thing I'll say on this point is that in the survey, we found that ADUs are more likely to be used for Airbnbs in affluent communities. So another reason why I think it's really important to help facilitate ADU development in low and moderate income neighborhoods, so that they can be, because our evidence shows that those households tend to use those for putting them on the market and actually housing people longer term.
Thanks, David. That's really helpful. Audience question here. I'll be presenting on ADUs at an upcoming historic preservation conference covering the benefits of ADUs and increased density. I'm interested in hearing successful examples of ADUs in historic areas, new construction, but also where outbuildings have been converted to ADUs. Is that something that any of our panelists feel like they can take on?
I mean, it is a little bit of a trickier question when you do have some of these historic regulations. I know in California, in our ADU pilot program with the City of Pasadena Affordable ADU program, there's a lot of historic areas in Pasadena, and so it is working with the local municipality if they have their own historic review. To make sure that it isn't a too long, a prohibitive reporting approach that they have to do back. I think San Diego actually is a really good best practices study if somebody wants to look in, this individual wants to look into what they do in their historic departments when it comes to their review periods in those areas.
Thank you, Gina. And also, I think I may have missed Summer's hand before. Summer, did you have something you can add there?
Actually, I wanted to make a comment about what David was talking about, short-term rentals, and according to our survey, also short-term rentals do not even come as like top 2, top 3 reasons why people want ADUs. What we are seeing, according to our 2021 ARP Home and Community Preference Survey, 86% want to build ADUs to provide home for a loved one who needs care. 86% also want for housing relatives or friends, and 74% want to create a place for the caregiver, which is a big issue. Like if you want proper caregiving, you can actually have the caregiver stay in the same property, which makes a huge difference. So we are seeing that it's short-term rental is not, and David was right that it may be in affluent communities you have ADUs as short-term rentals, but typically it's being used for these reasons to that. And I replied to someone's question about the ADU presentation. The ABCs of ADUs is a good document. You have a lot of examples in that of successful ADU implementation and buildings that have happened across the country, and the benefits of ADUs also. So you may look at that document.
Thanks, Summer. Sorry I missed your hand before. There's a question that has come through too about pre-approved designs. And the question here is, have you found pre-approved designs that are put out there by cities? Apparently Seattle may do this, but have you found that to be effective and usable? Anybody on the panel?
So I will just say that, just real quick, I think there is potential for pre-approved plans. We've seen some cities implement that. So for example, the city of San Jose has done some of this work. And the great thing about pre-approved plans is that it really can save money for the homeowner themselves to not have to design something from the ground up. And so it saves on time and cost. So as we continue to discuss ways in which to facilitate more ADU development for low and moderate income homeowners, having pre-approved plans could be really helpful, particularly because this is a construction project, right? So as much uncertainties you can take out of the process through having a pre-approved plan, that's only going to be helpful.
Yeah, and I wanted to say from the multifamily perspective, it's hard with pre-approved plans just because I think it's great on the single family side, and I hope that you know, I see a lot of other cities putting out calls and RFPs for those pre-approved plans. Multifamily, the idea is you want to make the units look like they were always a part of the rest of the building, and then you're uniform. You're converting within the existing building envelope. So it is a little bit harder for those pre-approved plans, but what's really helpful is cities will have prescriptive plans, and that can help fill in the gaps with the design and make the review period go faster. They're pre-approved prescriptive plans, things for like methane mitigation for structural. And so those are really helpful if those cities have that. And I would highly encourage anybody who's interested to look into it and see if the city has that. They can include that as part of their plan set to make the review period go more quickly.
Thanks, Gina. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience here before I turn it back to Mike Kinsella. Setbacks and maximum coverage were my largest barrier to an ADU ordinance. This especially applied to new detached residential zoning districts. I found that the best application was in older neighborhoods where non-conforming structures may exist. Are there examples of successful practices in new subdivisions?
So I will just say I haven't looked specifically at these issues in new subdivisions, but I know that a lot of, particularly in the Bay Area, there have been some developments built explicitly with ADUs on site. And so they've been able to make them work that way. Whether or not, I would actually look to learn more about this, whether or not buying a new home with an ADU already built in the back is actually used to be put on the market. I don't know. I think that's an open question, but it does seem to be workable for at least some groups in some cities in the Bay Area.
Thanks, David. And you know what, maybe before I hand it back to Mike, let me just, is there anything else that any of our panelists really just want to quickly mention before we close out the panel here?
Oh, Gina, you're muted.
I would just highly encourage just different states who are looking to adopt ADU reform to think about multifamily and not just single family, because that's a huge area of opportunity when you're already in a multifamily zone to add these additional units and create a much more rich housing stock there. And naturally, because of the size of ADUs, they're naturally more affordable in nature, and also it allows in areas that are maybe more affluent to create a different housing typology that didn't exist there before, and and provide maybe tenants who couldn't afford the area previously to live closer to where they work. And so I want to highly just put that out there, that's a great opportunity as we continue to adopt ADU reform. Thank you.
Okay.
I can add one more thing about ADU reforms. I would say is a lot of questions. I saw a couple of questions that said my city or my state has ADU legislation, but there's no production happening. So you may want to revisit the ADU legislation and see why is it not happening. There may be restrictive covenants because of which production for ADUs is not happening. I'll give you one example. As we speak today, Rhode Island the governor of Rhode Island is going to sign an ADU bill, which we worked on, and the House and the Senate passed, I think, a couple of days ago. But the current law that is there in Rhode Island, it did not allow for ADUs to be used by non-relatives or even non-relatives could not use it. And after the use of the ADUs, it had to be destroyed. So, or it has to be decommissioned, which does not make sense. If you're spending a lot of money on it, why do you want to decommission an ADU? So we worked on the ADU legislation, revisited and see what is an issue with that. We worked on it. We have removed the restrictive covenants, and hopefully once it's signed by Governor McKee, it's going to be, I'm not saying it's going to spur ADU development. When you get up next day there, you not see ADUs everywhere, but what may happen is it'll help the state actually come up with policies and come up with ways in which they can increase ADU production, which will allow people other than relatives to stay in ADU. So that's one example how you can revisit your legislation and see if there are any restrictive covenants and work on it and try to pass a one which has less restrictive covenants.
Thanks, Summer. I think we're reached the end of our time here, but thanks to you and Gina and David and Kelly and Mike, with thanks for you and your team and pulling this all together, I hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Greg. And it was a real pleasure just being part of this conversation. And I hope all of our audience and participants enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. I'd just like to end with, Up for Growth is a place where, as you can see on today's call, we bring together practitioners, policy experts, policymakers, and advocates to forge policies and solutions to our nation's severe shortage of homes. If you're interested in learning more, I would encourage you to go to upforgrowth.org and sign up to have a conversation around getting involved. I would also like to flag for everyone on our webinar today that in 3 weeks, on July 14, our organization will be launching its new Housing Under Production in the U.S. report, which both gets at the extent to which we've fallen short of meeting housing needs at the metropolitan level across the country, but also lays out a bold vision for change, including approaches dealing with missing middle and accessory dwelling units to both create more housing opportunities in high opportunity neighborhoods and also increase affordability. So if you're interested, go on to upforgrowth.org, register or sign up for our mailing list. Reach out to us. We would love to engage with all stakeholders represented on this call today to forge policies and partnerships to move the needle on this critical issue facing the nation. Thank you all again. And until next time, we appreciate you spending the last hour with us. Take care.